With the latest Resident Evil games running surprisingly well on Nintendo Switch 2, Resident Evil Requiem could be seen as the final boss. We're talking about the first big current generation AAA to launch on Nintendo Switch 2 day one, and Capcom hasn't held back on ambition to make sure this version delivers. After finishing the game and playing both docked and handheld, we can say what we already suspected. Capcom has pulled off the impossible to fit next-gen horror right in your hands, and the results somehow won't leave anyone indifferent. Here's our full review. Resident Evil Requiem is, above all else, a horror game. And that might sound obvious coming from a series that practically invented the genre, but it's not quite so obvious if you're only coming from the latest numbered entries. After two games that leaned into action with varying success, Capcom wanted to bring fear back as the core pillar without abandoning what it learned along the way. The result is a balance that, while it won't be perfect for everyone, works out pretty well. The big swing this time is the dual protagonist system. On one side, we have Grace Ashcroft, an FBI analyst with a personal connection to Raccoon City who dives headfirst into an investigation that spirals out of control. While on the other, we have the veteran Leon S. Kennedy, who really needs no introduction at all. They share the same story, but their sections play out in radically different ways, and that's exactly what gives Resident Evil Requiem its whole identity. Grace's chapters are built for anyone who misses that classic survival horror. Ammo is scarce, enemies are actually a real threat, and stealth matters more. Watching zombie patrol patterns, slipping by without making a sound, and deciding when it's actually worth spending a bullet are constant calls you'll be making. Grace also has a crafting system based on infected blood, letting her create heals, ammo, or lethal injectors that make enemies burst so you don't have to overthink every encounter. We think it adds a really interesting management layer that suits the game quite nicely. But with Leon, the tone shifts completely. His sections feel like the best of modern Resident Evil 4. Direct action, a varied arsenal, melee combos with his new axe, and a briefcase inventory system that pushes you to optimize every single slot. Now that doesn't mean Leon's parts lack tension, because some moments with him are genuinely suffocating, but the focus is just different. Here you can afford to be aggressive, and the game will reward you for it. Still with resource management, but with far more supplies available and the option to craft different kinds of items. Now, both characters can be played in either first person or third person, a series first that changes the experience quite a bit. The game works well from both perspectives, but each protagonist feels a bit more natural in one of them. Grace in first perspective, where the claustrophobia and tension hit harder, and Leon in third person, where you get a better read on the environment for combat. Story-wise, the game leans heavily into fan service, and honestly, we're totally fine with that. Numbered Resident Evil entries only come around every so often, so it makes sense that Capcom wants to reward the people who have stuck with this series for decades. That actually includes nods that tie the plot even to the live-action movies, which we actually like quite a bit because it helps glue together a universe that used to feel kind of all over the place. Now that said, if this is your first Resident Evil, all the context built up across so many games can kind of throw you off. And unfortunately, we didn't think there was any other way to do it if Capcom wanted to keep continuity in such a long-running saga. Overall, it feels like an evolution designed to satisfy two audiences that, until now, seem kind of incompatible. The ones who want pure horror and the ones who prefer action. And this pulls it off without either side feeling watered down. Now, there were a lot of doubts about how Resident Evil Requiem would handle Nintendo Switch 2. I mean, we're talking about a current-gen exclusive game, built to push PlayStation 5, Xbox Series, and PC, running on a console that you can hold in your hands. This is the first time Capcom has faced a challenge like this on Nintendo's hybrid system, and they went all in. They've tried to make Switch 2 deliver an experience as close as possible to the other platforms. And for the most part, they succeeded. In TV mode, the goal is pretty clear: prioritize visuals. Capcom has kept most of the lighting effects, particles, reflections, and ray tracing that brings the image closer to what you'd see on other consoles. Of course, DLSS does its job job upscaling from a lower internal resolution, and the final result, after the improvements versus what we saw in our hands-on impressions, is noticeably better than expected. Still, there are some obvious compromises. Textures lose detail, shadows get simplified, and the image just isn't as crisp as on PlayStation 5 Pro or PC. The performance target on TV is 60 frames per second, but in our tests, the game almost always sits between 40 and 60 FPS, hovering around 45 to 50 for most of the gameplay. It's not as smooth as a lock 60, but it never feels unpleasant either. And the important part is that there's barely any stutter or major frame pacing issues. The drops are usually smooth and don't break the flow. Basically, for a console this small, it's a surprising result. Where Resident Evil Requiem really left us speechless though is in handheld mode. Here, paradoxically, performance is better than on TV. The game holds up 60 frames per second, or very close to it, most of the time. The trade-off, of course, is a noticeable cut to resolution and effects quality, leaving a flatter image with less detail than TV mode. The visual gap between both modes is pretty obvious. However, Switch 2 screen is smaller, and that actually works in the game's favor. Those cutbacks are much easier to hide, and the experience still feels powerful. Playing Resident Evil Requiem handheld with headphones at night is one of the best ways to enjoy the game. To sum it up, on TV you get a more cinematic look with performance that's impressive for what the console is, even if not always perfect. Handheld is the opposite. Excellent performance at the cost of a more modest visual presentation. In both cases, it is still a step behind PlayStation 5 Pro, but it holds up well enough that you can enjoy the game without feeling like you're missing anything essential. Now, these performances for Grace Ashcroft and Leon S. Kennedy are very strong, living up to the quality of the previous entries. We really like Grace as a character because of how easy it is to empathize with her. I mean, someone relatively ordinary going through this terrible time, and thanks to a great performance, you can genuinely feel that she's suffering. One detail we loved is how the game uses silence as a tension tool, and it works just as well in Grace's sections as it does in Leon's. In Leon's battles, the sound design does a lean closer to the more action-focused entries, with more intensity and rhythm, but overall the audio treatment feels very consistent across the entire game. The story in Resident Evil Requiem has a length and pacing that felt perfect for what a series entry should be. The journey takes you from the medical center where everything begins, a brand new location that leaves veterans and newcomers equally lost, all the way to the ruins of Raccoon City, where longtime fans will feel right at home. That rhythm, the slowly moving through areas that become more and more familiar, is well handled and helps newcomers settle in before the game dives into the heavier lore. Resident Evil Requiem is an open world, but it does feature large areas that encourage you to explore at your own pace. Within each zone, you have the freedom to advance in a somewhat flexible order, and that's reinforced by the indirect interaction between Grace and Leon. If one character opens a door, the other can then take advantage of it later. So depending on how you play, the experience changes, and this mechanic is one of the game's strongest cards. Something that deserves a special mention is how Resident Evil Requiem blends puzzles, exploration, combat, and shooting without any of it feeling repetitive. I mean, this game is constantly shifting gears. You go from solving an environmental puzzle to sneaking past an enemy, and then straight into a tense firefight with limited resources. And it all sits on top of a horror foundation, the thread that ties every part together. That variety keeps the experience feeling fresh from start to finish. When it comes to difficulty options, Capcom has been very generous. The 3 modes cover a wide spectrum, but even easy still asks for some resource management and strategy. It's not gonna let you just stroll through the story. You still have to think, and you still have a rough time with the zombies. On the other end, the classic difficulty brings back ink ribbons for savings, cranking up the pressure significantly. The game also hides plenty of secrets and collectibles. The Mr. Raccoon figurines are back, scattered across the environments, and the story offers variations in its ending and in some early areas, which makes you want to replay it. On top of that, it includes an in-game achievement system that rewards you based on enemies defeated, challenges completed, and collectibles found, adding even more content for completionists like me, who of course are gonna need multiple playthroughs to finish everything at the highest level. The Switch 2 version includes motion controls that work pretty well in TV mode with a pro controller controller or Joy-Con 2. However, in handheld mode, the vertical axis isn't configured properly, which is fairly common with this kind of control scheme, and hopefully, Capcom will fix it soon with an update. I'm gonna say Resident Evil Requiem is possibly the most well-rounded entry the series has had in years. Capcom managed to pull off something that seemed really hard, bringing back the classic Resident Evil horror identity without giving up the action that's been such a big success in the latest entries. And the formula of combining Grace's horror with Leon's intensity works really well, and it holds up from start to finish without the pacing really dropping at any point. And the atmosphere, the settings, and the characters are all at an excellent level. It feels more Resident Evil than ever, the fear that keeps changing shape, moving from darkness and claustrophobia to action and resource management with a natural flow that maintains tension. But the most surprising part is that Nintendo Switch 2 handles all this more than decently. There are of course graphical concessions, but the overall look and visual presentation's impressive, both in TV mode and especially in handheld, where performance is excellent at the cost of a more modest visual finish. The RE engine pairs really well with the console, and that proves Nintendo's hybrid is ready for major releases from at least the current home console generation. Resident Evil Requiem is an outstanding horror game that arrives on Switch 2 in its most special version, and it's absolutely worth it. I mean, if you're a fan of the series, it's a must-play. And if you're looking for a AAA horror game, it can be an excellent entry point to the franchise, especially with the rest of the recent entries available on Switch 2. So tell me, what did you think of Resident Evil Requiem on the console? Did it meet your technical and gameplay expectations? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next videos. Thanks for watching, see you next time!